Hello and welcome to the latest edition of Shaken Not Burned. As ever, this week we're going to talk about three of the big stories of the week, which tell us something about how the world of sustainability is changing. I'm joined by my co-hosts, Julia Bottaro and Heather Dinwoody. And today we're going to kick off with Julia's favourite story of the week.
Hello, everyone. My favorite story today is about energy trends. Trends in CO2 emissions generated from energy use last year. So the International Energy Agency has released some numbers, and it showed that emissions still increased last year, but they would have been 3 times larger in the last 5 years had we not expanded the use of clean energy technologies. So, for example, renewable energy and electric vehicles. I think there are some really interesting points to take out from the study. One thing that I find a little bit mind-blowing is that the CO2 emissions generated by electricity generation would have actually decreased last year had droughts not impacted hydropower output. So in some countries like China and the United States, there was an exceptional shortfall in hydropower, and that's because of climate change. So what I find interesting is that, we are counting on natural resources, so, abundant water bodies for hydropower, and then climate change is actually ruining it. So I think that, moving forward, or not even moving forward really, like now, we need to plan thinking of the drastic changes that are happening around the world. And, they are basically impacting our plans. And then, another good thing that we found is that advanced economies saw a record fall in their CO2 emissions last year, even as their GDP grew. So this is called decoupling. So that's when emissions are falling, but economic production is rising. And that's a good thing because, we live in a capitalistic society. So the value of everything is measured in how much money we make. So everyone wants the GDP to rise. But then at the same time, we also need to limit our environmental impact. So one solution here is to still grow our economy without generating as many emissions. And that happened, which is good. Obviously, there are other environmental impacts to keep in mind. But overall, I would say a bit of a mixed bag announcement. But so much to unpack. What do you think?
One of the things I think is particularly interesting here is you mentioned the idea of decoupling emissions growth from energy demand growth. And what that actually shows us is that the policy frameworks and financial incentives that were put in place to drive down the cost of renewables and to drive up the rapid deployment of renewable energy has worked. Because if we're still growing our energy demand, but we're cutting our emissions from energy consumption, that decoupling means that we are changing the sort of development path of our economies. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that's going to be enough to address the sort of take, make, waste model of modern economic activity. But it's a really interesting piece of information because it shows that whatever concerns there may be from people in the market about, intervening in the market, it works. And given that one of the reasons we're trying to intervene in the market is that the market doesn't actually price in environmental damage, that's really exciting.
Personally, I would be quite interested in hearing a bit more about the methodology. So when you're saying that some of the more advanced economies are decoupling emissions, I would be quite interested in working out how they have linked emissions to different economies, because I think, it's all like you see, so I'm going to use plastic as an example, but you see all these reports saying, oh, this country's the worst for plastic and everything. And a lot of the time it's just outsourced production and outsourced waste. So I would be quite interested in knowing how they're managing that in terms of calculating emissions.
Yeah, I mean, this one is about the energy use specifically. So it's possible that the advanced economy, I mean, it says here that the reason why they decline is because there is less electricity being made from coal, for example. There is more energy efficiency. There are more renewables deployment. So yeah, I mean, whether they are still importing energy made by burning coal in other country, that's, to be fair, that's beyond what I read. But that would be something to definitely learn more about.
Well, I definitely think that's something we should all be more concerned about when we're reading, because actually the methodologies people use to decide what it is they're going to research kind of defines what it is we're actually learning about. And if we don't understand the reasoning behind those decisions, we don't really understand what's being compared. One of the things that came out this week was confirmation that the UK Treasury is going to regulate ESG ratings providers. One of the reasons for that is to get comparisons of methodologies, so people know if they're comparing apples with apples or kangaroos, because apple versus a kangaroo is a bit confusing.
I mean, I don't want to be skeptical, and I'm not saying that emissions haven't fallen or been decoupled and everything, but I do think it's worth looking at. And even if it is the case that they've considered this sort of importing of energy and that kind of thing, we do still need to address, and I'm really trying to avoid saying developing countries because I really don't like that
Why
terminology.
don't we use high income, middle income and low income countries?
Okay, let's go with that. So at some point, we will need to get to the same stage in low-income countries that still need to build up. And I think getting that agreement in place is going to be very difficult. I think getting the action is going to be very difficult, and it's only made harder by higher income countries outsourcing more and more production, because yes, this study isn't recording production as such, but production takes energy, doesn't it?
But I would say, I think you're right, and I think it's an issue that needs to be resolved. But fundamentally, what we're talking about is a disconnect between energy demand growth and energy-related emissions. So that's a global overview. And the whole point about carbon emissions is it almost doesn't matter where they're emitted because it affects the atmosphere and the climate as a whole. It's not like the biodiversity concern when local absolutely rules everything.
Although that does come to something that we haven't touched upon from the story yet, which is the reliance on hydropower and how those resources are closing up. Because yes, carbon emissions have the same effect wherever they're generated, but the effects of global warming are being felt more severely in certain areas where hydropower is a really massive resource. And you could say the same for changes in wind patterns and stuff, because we're getting more hurricanes and everything than we were before. We're getting burst storms than we were before, and turbines can't work in those conditions.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely something that I found the most fascinating part, because the intention is there, but then climate is working against us, after obviously we've worked against it for a very long time. But going back to the point of low-income countries, I was at a conference this week, and there was a discussion on how AI can help the development of renewable energy. And one way is, because obviously the concept is that we want energy to be decentralized because it works better, it's more flexible, it's more adaptable to the single uses in various areas. But obviously, when it's decentralized, it's harder to control. So you can use AI to support that. And, the discussion on the panel was about the fact that in the richer economies, what is being done now is developing modeling. So you first do all the modeling about these decentralized systems, and then you do pilot plans, and then when they work, then you can implement at scale. So this is to allow the modeling to, build emergency plans, contingency plans in case something happens, like some problems happen. And then someone's asked, okay, great, but how about the low-income countries that some of them, are still building new fossil fuel capacity? And the person on stage said, well, I think they will just leapfrog. They will just keep the piloting bit, and they'll just go from the modeling to the implementation. So, it's possible that...
But there is an issue. I'm sorry to interrupt you. I know I'm terrible at it. But I mean, the thing is, there is this assumption that low-income countries are going to leapfrog traditional fossil fuel infrastructure, and, the AI and machine learning and digital twins are going to enable rapid deployment of low-cost renewable energy. But that simulation, that planning, that technology's got to be paid for somehow. And that, I'm afraid, brings us back to the issues of climate finance, to the countries in the negotiations of where the incentives lie for capital to be, apportioned to that kind of investment rather than the traditional models. If we're talking about things that drive change in behaviour, then perhaps it's time we turn to Heather for her story of the week.
Thanks, Felicia. Yeah. So my story this week, I'm actually feeling very positive about, and it's a very interesting one, I think. So this is basically the European Parliament has just agreed to some new rules on environmental crimes and sanctions. So they've expanded the list of what constitutes as an environmental crime. They've harmonized sanctions, and those are including things like fines and imprisonment. Now, so it's passed by quite an overwhelming majority. It was approved by 499 members of Parliament, opposed to 100. And EU member states will now have 2 years to integrate this into their own sort of national legislation. And I mean, so among the new crimes they've created, well, not created, among the things that they have now deemed to be environmental crime, there's things like illegal timber trade, the depletion of water resources, the import or use of mercury and F-gases. They've also brought in stricter sanctions for the destruction of protected ecosystems and sites. And what this means is that individual people and company representatives could be facing these sort of newly tightened sanctions. So there could be prison sentences of 5 to 10 years, or fines of sort of 3 to 5% of global revenue, or up to 40 million euros, plus requirements to recover the environment that has been damaged. And I think this is really exciting to me. It kind of follows on from something that we were discussing last week about kind of liability and the need to see these actions as crimes rather than just harms, because that gives us a way of sort of punishing them effectively.
I think we need to be careful with the word punishment, because it sounds really quite aggressive. This is where I always try and use the term accountability, because part of the problem with the idea of them being harms, not crimes, is nobody's held responsible. So it's accountability rather than punishment. This is not a moral thing. This is just you shouldn't do this. It's bad for the economy. It's bad for society. And if you contravene this rule, this law, then you will suffer the consequences.
I mean, I would argue that means much the same as punishment. I would also say, I mean, in my mind, this is about punishment. We're talking about the penal justice system here. We're talking about justice, and that is, call it suffering the consequences, call it punishment. But it is basically saying, yes, you're accountable for what you've done, and it's not going to be a rap on the knuckles. This is serious, and we're treating it seriously in a way that we haven't before, because we've just sort of said, oh, well, this company might have had something to do with it, they've been slightly bad, whereas now we're saying you have been objectively wrong. And I do think that's a really important and powerful difference to make. I also think this idea of individual responsibility, so the fact that specific people and company representatives could wind up in prison for up to 10 years, I think that serves as a real disincentive in a way that corporate responsibility hasn't historically.
I think it would be interesting to see how that is translated into, corporate incentives and disincentives, because, these very same chief executives that are rewarded financially when they grow the share price of a company, for example, to the detriment of the environment, well, now they could just go to prison, because ultimately it's all down to upper management. So yeah, I think that's great. That's really interesting.
But this is a really interesting area, because who's going to be held responsible? Because so much of the time, I think a lot of the decisions that are made that are negative, no one really seems to stand out as being responsible for it. It's all somebody trying to do their best and get close to the budget and make sure the boss is happy. And so much of it is not thinking things through. But it should be senior management that takes responsibility, not junior people who are just trying to do the best they can within the frameworks that they've been given for their company operations.
Yeah, I think this shows that this will, this should enable systemic change in the corporate world, because the way that the corporate world works kind of goes against, doesn't align with this new law. So we need to change things quite deeply.
Exactly. I think in part this is a way of getting around that problem of no one being held responsible, because, historically, say there's been a massive oil spill or something, there would probably be, I don't know exactly how the process would work, but I imagine there would be a bit of an inquiry. There's people pointing blame, yes, but after a while it just kind of fizzles out. The company pays a settlement or a fine maybe, but there's less effort put into finding an individual to hold responsible. And I think if you've got an actual legislative framework that says this is crime, there's a bit more of an incentive to find out who's responsible. And I'm not saying we should throw people to the wolves or anything, but I am saying that I could go on a whole big rant about how severely we treat sort of what we would call blue collar crime, so things like shoplifting or drug possession and everything. And why are we so determined to hold these people accountable for something relatively minor that might have, yes, I'm not saying it's victimless, but a massive oil spill or something along those lines, something that destroys a huge part of the planet, is arguably a lot more harmful. And I think we should be coming down hard on people.
It's a lot more harmful and harmful to a lot more people. And that's a really interesting dichotomy, this idea of white-collar, blue-collar crime. And that blue-collar crime is about personal responsibility. It's supposed to be, you're supposed to be better than that. But white-collar crime is like, oh, well, they didn't hurt anyone.
And this is what infuriates me, because I would argue that blue-collar crime does come from systemic issues. I'm not saying that is always the case, but I would say in the vast majority of cases it's because of social unrest, it's because of poverty, it's all linked in with drugs or whatever it is. Whereas a lot of these big environmental crimes are done out of greed. They're done out of trying to please shareholders. And I would argue if we're going to come down hard on anyone, if we're going to hold individuals responsible, if we're going to become that individualistic, then this is the area we should be focusing on.
This is such a good point, Heather, and this reminds me of the fact that we are now, the government in the UK is cracking down hard on climate protesters. what have they done? They're like highlighting issues. And yeah, so if we really care so much about accountability and we are imprisoning people that do slow marches, then by all means, let's imprison the people that are causing the climate harm. Crime, sorry, not harm.
Well, it's only fair.
Just imprison everyone. Why not?
See you in prison.
Okay, imprisoning everyone might be going a little bit too far for a Thursday. But listen, I think that's a really good point to move on to my favourite story of the week, which in many ways isn't actually a story, but it's research, and it's talking about carrot and stick. What works better? Should we be pushing regulation? Should we be pushing the criminalisation of environmental harm? Or should we focus on incentives for particular forms of wanted behaviour? This is such a challenge, given that we've supposedly been trying to work on the realignment of capital towards the amelioration of climate change or nature protection. And now there's a lot of discussion of the importance of transition finance and how we've got to pay fossil fuel companies to be less damaging. And I think that's a challenge for a lot of people to get their heads around. But there's some research that's just come out of the University of Nevada and the University of Michigan, which actually talks about corporate carbon footprint and how the biggest contributor to a decline in that footprint is financial incentives. Now, it's specifically those that make it cheaper to buy solutions that reduce energy use, so often energy efficiency measures. They've always been known to be the most cost-effective, easiest, lowest hanging fruit of the energy consumption world. But actually what the research is showing, certainly in the US, that this is what really, really, really works. So direct emissions amongst the study actually went up over the last decade, which is a bit terrifying. The researchers looked at 184 large companies. But what the study looked at was the assets of those companies that actually saw declining emissions. And the idea, what is it that makes the difference? Is it corporate initiatives? Is it city climate action plans? Is it state or federal regulations? Or was it financial incentives? This matters because it tells us about where interventions for decarbonisation are successful. And what they actually found was that it's financial incentives that has the biggest impact. And it also lowers the cost of deploying solutions which could work elsewhere. So there's a really interesting link between financial incentives which cut corporate emissions, how those incentives also cut the cost of deployment, and how that lower cost of deployment can spread across borders. Now, obviously, this is a carrot and stick thing. What is the best way forward? And I think this is particularly interesting in an election year where there's elections pretty much everywhere around the world. We're looking for countries to be fulfilling their NDCs and, trying to achieve their targets under Paris. But with the growing politicization about ESG, the politicization of reporting on climate risk, we have to become really aware of what works and why and how we frame those stories. Because actually the very fact that these incentives are about cutting energy use means for those companies it's often an economic story that's driving their action. This for me is fascinating because it builds on the Carbon Majors report, which came out, crikey, when did it come out? It must be 6 or 7 years ago, which just talked about the largest companies in the world being responsible for about 70% of historical emissions. That's okay. It's to do with fossil fuel producers, and it doesn't mean that that's the day-to-day operations of those companies, but it's about their downstream use. So I just think it's really important that we understand what is driving action on decarbonisation, what countries can do to be most effective. Because in the US, we've got the Inflation Reduction Act, In the EU, we've got, all the green plans, which it's a combination of policy and incentives. But it's this idea, what makes the difference? What will make us cut emissions? And I just think it's fascinating that we've got these stories about how we can decouple emissions from energy demand growth. We've got stories about how we're pushing frameworks and basically hardening the line on what constitutes environmental crime and who should be held responsible, while also learning that certainly in the US, and I'm sure that model can be replicated in other places, financial incentives really do work.
I think I see both points of this, because I do see what you're saying, and that we need to know what's driving change in order to sort of ramp it up. I must admit, I find it really depressing. I just want to live in a world where people do good things out of goodness rather than what I see as good,
Heather,
really.
Can I say that one of the things I love about working with you is I love your idealism and your belief. I am older and a bit tireder, and sometimes just look for the pragmatic solutions today while we work on changing everybody's mind to live a nicer life later.
I mean, I see what you mean, but a girl has to dream, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure the corporate world is that type of world where everyone does nice things for the sake of it.
But I think it's interesting the point you make about how things like reducing energy actually has its own financial benefit before you even consider the incentives. And you could say the same thing about protecting ecosystems, because that's protecting maybe your supply chain against long-term risks. It's also complying with new regulations and everything. It's pleasing customers and appealing to a wider consumer base. So I just can't help thinking, like, you're already getting a benefit, and it just upsets me that it takes financial incentives to add to that further motivation. But I do take your point, and if it does, then good, ramp it up, do more of it.
This is why I want to see every company implementing a sustainability strategy, because it's only when you do that that very first step of saying what is material to my business, that's when companies start to understand where they sit, how reliant they are on nature, how reliant they are on robust supply chains, and they can start to actually think through and plan what the implications are for climate change and nature loss.
I think here is just about, again, changing completely the way the companies think, because, like we said earlier, you need to change the way that you reward executives. And here is, you need to change the way that you see the world is not just infinite resources that you can extract at your pleasure, at your leisure. You need to see how you are depending on them. And so if you deplete them, then you can't depend on them anymore. They're gone.
Absolutely. And it's that interdependencies that utterly fascinates me. It's that thing of questioning how people view the world, because to me, it makes no sense that you can look at an economy and argue that it exists independently of nature. We literally exist within nature. The trees that clean the air that we breathe and keep the temperature down, and the water that's fundamental to life, and all of these things. Economic activity exists within nature. We can't see it independently. And climate change is rapidly changing our relationship with nature. And our loss of nature is changing our ability to actually be resilient to climate change. So I don't understand why people aren't thinking about this over time horizons beyond the next 6 months.
Well, because we've spent, as a humanity, we spent centuries thinking that we are more than nature, we are elevated, we are brains, we're not bodies. And so now this is coming crashing down, really. And only now we're realizing, actually, we are also part of nature, but we thought we were too cool for it earlier.
I like the idea of being too cool for nature.
Nature is too cool.
I hate the idea, but it's a great line.
No, it's the other way around. Nature is too cool for us.
Oh, no, that's scary.
Well, she's powerful. Anyway, this is not very positive. No.
No, but what is very positive is our interview for later this session, because the UK has actually introduced biodiversity net gain. So that's an attempt to actually, to take positive action on the health of nature. So we'll get to that. Hello and welcome back to Shaken Not Burned. We're lucky enough to be joined today by Shashan Mishra, who's the Vice President of EMEA at AiDash. Shashan, can you tell us a little bit about you and AiDash and what you do?
Yeah, we are a satellite data first company. We use satellite data, combine it with other data sources, and then build AI-based solutions for solving problems at scale. The problem that my team here works on and I work on is around sustainability, where we're building technology to measure and improve biodiversity on land.
That's a really interesting area to be in, because obviously there's so much work going on around the world at a policy level, trying to find a way for countries and companies to manage their impact on nature. Can you talk us through a little bit about what that actually means? So, for example, in the UK, we've recently had this new policy deployed, which is biodiversity net gain. Could you sort of explain what that is, why it matters, and who it's going to affect?
Yeah, I think let's start with who's going to affect. It's going to affect all of us, and that's because UK specifically is one of the most biodiversity depleted countries in the world. However, we're not just the only ones who are biodiversity depleted. Latin America has lost over 90% biodiversity in the last 50, 60 or 50 to 70 years, and same is the case throughout. This loss specifically in the UK. It's not for the UK, it's for England at the moment. And Scotland and other countries within the UK are trying to come up with their own versions of it. But this law is trend setting because England is the first country to have such an active law and already has started enforcing it. Taking England's cue, Europe is coming up with a law which has now been passed just a week and a half ago. So that's going to happen. And other countries are also following similar leads. If you look at the details of the law and what it requires, it is very similar to what the Global Biodiversity Framework has asked for, and UK has agreed to that as well. So I think that's one thing that should make us all very proud about, even though we've got less biodiversity in the country, but that should change, and that our country is leading in there. What it means is for us, what it means on a day-to-day basis is that what we should be able to see, if we're buying a house in a new development, we should be able to see that the land there is managed differently. All the developers, they are required to measure the biodiversity on the land before the development begins. And after the development, they need to bring it up to 10% more than the original baseline for the entire land, including the area where they have done the development. And if they're not able to do that, they can buy biodiversity credits, but the law requires them to buy credits locally. So if it means that if you're living in a new built house where there is not enough biodiversity net gain being done or possible, you would still see improvement in the local areas because the developer would have to buy credits from somewhere locally.
That's an amazing thing to me, because obviously I think quite a few people are aware of the idea of carbon credits, but the difference between carbon and biodiversity is that with CO2, it doesn't matter where it's emitted in the world because it affects the atmosphere in the same way. But with biodiversity, different places in the world aren't replaceable with each other. You have to have stuff that works on a local basis. I mean, can you tell us anything about how that is expected to work?
Yeah, so CO2 measurement is also easy because in the end, it's one molecule's weight that we are measuring. We're just measuring how much equivalent of carbon dioxide or harvested carbon is captured in a specific place or a tree. And that's easier because it's only a single measurement to be done, and it's easily convertible because everywhere around the world, that's what carbon market is doing. Biodiversity is difficult to measure because it is made up of the variety of plants and variety of animals. And that could be difficult to quantify in a single unit. So the way the unit has been defined is that it is an indirect observation for the animal life and a direct observation for plant life. And then so ecologists would go, or you would use technology like in our case, to look at the land and identify what is the flora distribution and follow the metric that has been given by the regulators to do that. Based on that, you create a view of how much land is acquired by what kind of habitat. And then there are additional questions that need to be answered to assess how significant is this habitat for the location and what is the condition of the habitat. And that together gives us an indication of the quality of flora and fauna both. That then applies, then there are standard metrics that have been published by the regulators, by DEFRA, that you can then use to calculate how much biodiversity unit is captured in a land. The idea behind this is quite simple. If you're looking at a piece of land in, let's say, York, and you're looking at a piece of land in London, and you come up and with a calculation that says that both pieces of land have 100 biodiversity units, that's comparable and that's equal. And even though they're physically far apart, and even though the actual habitats may be completely different from each other, they're still comparable to each other based on that unit.
Okay.
So it creates that fungible unit that can be used by the industry. And then based on that, the entire biodiversity trading can get created, allowing people to go ahead and do the developments without worrying about whether they're going to be able to do it on site or not.
Okay, but I mean, that must bring up an enormous amount of complexity and challenges in how you access that data. Because, I mean, you mentioned ecologists being out on the land and literally identifying what's out there and how much of that there is. But I can't imagine that's possible to do on a countrywide basis.
It's not. So when I first found out how an ecologist does this survey and how they actually create the map, I was surprised about the process. They would actually take GPS devices on the field, and it's hard work. They would take GPS devices on the field. So if they see a grassland on the field, they would walk along the edge of it using the GPS device, and it tracks their path. And then they would go and do the same for every habitat that they can, or they would stand and then draw the rest of it. And then they would come back, use the GPS device to get data from it, and then create the map of all the habitats on the ground. That's a lot of work being done. I mean, a single site of 10 hectares to 20 hectares can take, for that ground survey, and all of that drawing can take about a week. And we're using, and ecologists, these are experts on the how to achieve the net gain, what kind of changes the land should happen. And they're being used for, we have to first rely on them to do that work on the ground that could fairly be automated using technology. And so that they can spend their time on more value-added tasks that are actually relying on their expertise and bringing out the right decision making rather than doing a physical job that can be done by
So in a
machine.
sense, what AiDash is doing is providing a solution that, for lack of a better phrase, does the grunt work for the biodiversity net gain, that actually gets the data for ecologists to build their planning on.
I call it collaborative AI. So that's how we should think of AI as well. There is a lot of news around AI trying to take jobs, but I don't think most of the AI is trying to do that. Almost none of it is trying to do that. What it's really trying to do, and what we are trying to do, is build AI that collaborates with the human expert, allowing them to not focus on the grunt job, as you mentioned, and focus on more value-added decision making, use the raw insights coming from the machine, and then do what the machine cannot do, apply the context. And that's where the human ability comes in, which is going to be extremely difficult for machine to replace.
So could you explain exactly how the technology works and what is the work that AiDash does do?
Yeah, sure. So the way our technology works is we use high resolution satellite imaging, where one pixel in an image is about 50 centimeter by 50 centimeter on the ground. In some cases, we go out and use images that are as high resolution as 12.5 centimeter each side of the pixel. So you can use those images, and if you zoom in completely, you can see a lot of detail on the ground. And using those images combined with ground truth data, we have trained algorithms that can identify almost every habitat that occurs in the UK, not just in England. And then we combine it with other information like soil data that allows us to further refine and apply some rules and further refine the determination done by the system. What this does allows us to do is through different sets of algorithms. It's not just one single algorithm. It never is. It's always a layer of things that you have to build. It draws at scale the boundaries between the habitats. It identifies single trees. It identifies anything that's growing in a line like a hedgerow, and it draws them. So at the end of it, we have everything identified, regardless of whether it's a 5 hectare area we're looking at or 5,000 hectare. And then the next set of algorithms come in and they look at each feature identified on the ground, and then they start labeling it. So they would call it, it's a line, it's a single line, and it's a line of trees. But the other one is not a line of trees, it's a hedgerow. It can tell them apart. If it's a grassland, what kind of grassland it is. And there the goal always is, when doing that labeling, the goal is to be able to map it and give the labels to the users that are exactly as required in the statutory requirements. So that allows users to have a beginning point where they're getting a ground data for the survey done on the ground through the AI, but it is giving them labels and detailed information that maps to the regulatory requirements. And all they have to do then is start working on the system to plan what kind of changes would work. And that's where the expertise comes in, because now based on where the location is, the ecologist knows best on what kind of changes should be done given the kind of habitats that are there. So those are the additional tools that we provide to run them the scenarios, allow them to run the scenarios, um, and find out the best way to achieve the 10%, given the whatever targets they have, which could be around the cost, which could be around specific habitats to be promoted, and they can also see what is the right place to place the construction if there are such options available. So they can do all of those scenarios, and then they can come with the best case scenario that can then go ahead and become part of the planning application.
I mean, it's fascinating to listen to, and one of the things that interests me is it's very obvious to me how what you're doing is going to be important to developers in England. Are there other opportunities that you can see arising from the biodiversity net gain policies?
Yes, so I think the Environment Act itself came in afterwards. There were requirements that already existed for specific industries to improve the quality of land they're managing. And that's where we actually had the first user base come in. So, for example, Ofgem gave National Grid a target to achieve a biodiversity net gain on all of their land which is occupied by the power substations and gas terminals. And it's an aggressive target. The Environment Act gives developers 30 years to achieve 10% net gain. Ofgem's target to National Grid was 10 to 14% between 2020 and 2030. And they're going for 14%, and they're using a technology for that. But that's where they were the first set of users. We've now find that there are water companies that have similar targets given by Ofwat, and they have other measurements that Environment Agency does on how they're managing the land. And they're using our technology to be able to not just achieve the BNG target from Ofwat, but they're also using it to improve their rating with Environment Agency. So from one star rating to 4-5 star rating, and using this technology to be able to drive the changes on the land to become that. And while it may not sound like much, there's few companies, but these companies control locally for all of us. These utilities control a large amount of land. And this means that now that they're using tech, they're able to achieve this at a cost that makes it feasible. We should start seeing even that area start to improve. So biodiversity would start improving in many ways as a result. But because of Environment Act, it's not just the developers,
It's landowners.
It's the whole landowners as well, because I mentioned the biodiversity credits. And the credits would come from somebody who has land available to create the credit and sell it in the market. And that's where landowners come in. They have a huge opportunity to use unused land that this could be land that's sandwiched between the buildings. This is land that is next to a constructed plot already, and they're not going to do anything, and it's existing green space. They can convert it into a BNG credit site. These could be small sites, but all put together, they can generate credit that not only improve the biodiversity in those areas, but also create a secondary cash flow. And what we're finding is that apart from landowners, there's a third class as well who's going to create biodiversity credits, and that's farmers. Farmers used to get a lot of subsidies, and post-Brexit, some of the subsidies have gone away, and there's that cash crunch that has gotten created. But we're finding that some of the users who are registered with us, they are small companies that are trying to create a business model around using our technology to help farmers identify the opportunities for BNG and create BNG credits on their site and become a seller and generate that additional cash flow or replace the cash flow that they've lost.
That's a really, really interesting aspect of this, because does that mean that those farmers who are looking at developing regenerative farming models are actually going to be able to supplement that with biodiversity credits?
Yes, so they can supplement that. You cannot supplement carbon with biodiversity. So if somebody is trying to use their land for creating carbon credits, they cannot sell biodiversity credits on it. That's not allowed in the law. But yes, I think if they're doing regenerative farming, there are still ways to use that land and areas around the land. So, for example, setting up between different fields, create a hedgerow between the fields, and that's how you improve biodiversity. Set up trees around the field or in distribute the fields. I'm not an ecologist, so I can't say exactly what's the best way to do that. But those are some of the things I've learned from my ecologists, and that can be done by the farmers as well. To while they're doing regenerative farming, other practices around improving the quality of farming they're doing, they can create BNG credits and earn extra revenue from that.
That's incredibly encouraging to see how different approaches can be used to complement each other in a move towards a more sustainable future. Now, of course, I'm going to ask you the question I always ask. Is there something I haven't asked you about AiDash and your new BNG technology that I should have done?
Well, I think one thing that I can tell you about this, which we've not covered so far, is how you mentioned initially about ecologists can't cover the entire country. So as we're making this product, we've just talked about UK right now, but Europe's coming up with its own law. Australia is doing that. Australia is the size of US. US is trying to come. US is slightly behind the cycle, but they're coming up with their own requirements as well. And when they do, then that's going to be a huge area to cover too. Canada is doing it, which is equally large country. So when we are building this technology, our vision is not to create something that helps cover England. We're building technology that can cover the globe, that can automatically and through automated processes look at the satellite, use satellite images, and at a global level, across millions of hectares, create that determination at the level of detail required for BNG, and provide that to our users. And that's the only way we see that this whole concept and the approach globally around achieving biodiversity net gain can actually be made true. We're not going to be the only ones to create the technology. Right now, England is leading, and within England, it seems like we've got a slight lead, but I'm pretty sure there are going to be more companies that are going to build technology, and it'll be good competing with them on that. But that's the goal we are going for.
And I'm quite sure there will be competition, because that's the sign of a healthy market. And It's fascinating to hear about the ways in which AI, which, as you say, is often being discussed in the media as a bit of a sort of, a threat to labour, but actually it's a means of ensuring that we can scale up our action in areas that we really need to make a change.
Yeah, I think in this area, the expertise is extremely rare to come by. And in England, our analysis tells us that there are about 8,500 ecologists. But not all of them are working on BNG. About 85% of local authorities, and local authorities have a very key role in the implementation of this law, because all of these BNG applications are part of planning applications that go to local authorities, the councils. And they have to look at the new component of the planning application now. They have to assess whether the baseline is accurate or not. And with 85% councils not having a single ecologist on the payroll, that's a nearly impossible task. So we're talking to many of them, and what we hear is sometimes some councils say that I'm going to accept baseline as it comes from the developer for most of the projects. And I'm only able to go and review the baseline for the most high profile projects or the largest of the projects. There is no bandwidth available. If they want to hire the ecologists from the market, there is not enough budget available. to cover 100% of the projects.
I think there's something really interesting here, which is we hear more and more of NGOs, legal NGOs, taking the UK to court for not fulfilling the Climate Change Act in the right way. But you've actually got a possibility that you'll have NGOs demanding action from councils and looking for this kind of work in order to be able to check that people are doing what they say they're doing.
I think we're going to see some of that. What we're seeing right now is that wildlife trusts are stepping in because they are not for profit. So they are stepping in, they are providing their services to the councils as well. And I think that's going to help quite a bit because they have a huge ecology expertise and they can support councils up to a point. But I don't think they have enough amount of people as well to be able to support all the councils as well as do what they are doing. That's not possible. So that there is definitely a gap that needs to be bridged.
And that's what AiDash is planning on doing.
That's what we are trying to do. That's what we're here for. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your time today, Shashin. It's absolutely fascinating and really interesting to learn more about how the market around us is changing. For those of you who've joined us today, thank you so much for listening. Don't forget to follow us on your favourite podcast platform, and you can find out more information about how to get in touch with AiDash in the show notes.